Hello, my name is John Maurer, and this presentation titled Resilient Energy for the 21st Century covers green renewable forms of energy, the trend toward renewables, and the associated benefits as well as threats to our nation's energy security. The need to find and utilize greener, more sustainable forms of energy is on the rise, which is a good thing, but along with it is the need to make these systems more resilient to the threats and hazards that they face. The term community resilience is the ability to prepare for anticipated hazards, to adapt to changing conditions and withstand the recovery from disruptions to what we define as a normal way of life. As we better understand the threats and hazards posed by various sources of energy and the increasing risk of relying on traditional sources of carbon-based energy, it's clear that as we become more focused on energy resilience in the 21st century, we are leaning toward a multifaceted approach to achieving energy resilience. This includes green renewable forms of energy in our efforts to combat climate change. With this shift, though, comes some challenges as emergency managers need to better understand these emerging threats and hazards to these different technologies. A 2010 UN study showed that the top 3 climate change related risks are increasing costs of natural resources and raw materials, water scarcity, and energy security. So we see that energy security is a major concern this century and will continue to be. Here's a snapshot of US primary energy consumption by energy source in 2019. We can see that renewables came in at 11% of total energy within the United States. Biomass, interestingly enough, was 43% of that 11%. According to an international study conducted in 2020 by the World Economic Forum, a failure of climate change mitigation and adaptation is this year's #1 long-term risk by impact and #2 by likelihood. While the debate about human-caused climate change continues, regardless of whether it's mostly a natural or human-caused problem, there is general consensus that we have a problem that we must deal with as policymakers, as urban planners, and of course, as emergency managers in the community as a whole. The study called out the need for a shift from carbon-based economy to natural gas, electrification, renewables, nuclear, and hydrogen. And this will require other innovations as we protect and secure these new forms of energy. Some examples of different types of green energy sources include biomass, wave energy, solar, hydroelectric, geothermal, and wind. Evolving technologies that offer great promise and are receiving more investment, including especially hydrogen as of late, in advanced energy storing technologies, advances in high capacity batteries. So planning for resilient renewables, a recent article in Resources magazine claimed that studying and planning for resilience within the context of a renewable dominated energy grid is important for a few reasons. First of all, increased physical vulnerability. When we think about wind and solar and these types of things, they have an increased vulnerability to weather. They're not like your traditional power plant that has more of a protective barrier, if you will, for the operations that occur within that power plant. Next, increased resilience on, or reliance rather, on transmission and distribution is also a concern. Extreme events that cause prolonged outages normally impact distribution and transmission lines. An increased reliance on renewable energy resources may also create an increased dependence on distribution lines, since most small renewables produce power locally on these power lines rather than a centralized power plant. Transmission lines may also grow in importance given the need to transmit renewables over long distances for reliability purposes. An increased reliance on both distribution and transmission infrastructure in a renewable dominated grid could therefore exacerbate the consequences of an extreme weather event on the grid. Public-private partnerships are a very important piece to advancing energy resilience in the 21st century. we need to collaboratively plan together between government and the private sector. And we need to increase our need for this type of planning if we're going to be successful. So we can see that, various threats to the electric grid and energy sources include climate change, natural and man-made disasters, increasing population demands, etc. Government and businesses are rethinking the need for greater investment in regional networks and redundant systems, especially critical or essential infrastructure. And so when we think about energy resilience, then the public-private partnerships play a key role in that. So with regard to mitigation recommendations, first and foremost, we want to look at our national governance, which calls out core capabilities. And specifically, there are 32 core capabilities, but these 7 or 8 here specifically are important when we think about energy. So we have threats and hazards identification, which we must do a good job of. We have risk and disaster resilience assessment for a particular facility. We have ongoing planning and preparedness that must occur. We have to prepare our community to be more resilient. We must do a good job with public information and warning and long-term vulnerability reduction as well. And operational coordination between first responders and facilities themselves is really critical. So each facility should ensure employment of these capabilities and make mitigation a cornerstone of a culture of preparedness against disasters. Some key plans to look at include the National Protection Framework and the National Infrastructure Protection Plan, or NIPP. Some strategic factors to think about as well when it comes to operating an energy business, I listed here on the right side. Include improving system resiliency with green renewables in mind and these types of planning processes in mind, establishing collaborative policies that are in alignment with climate resilience goals, replacing aging infrastructure with green alternatives, and managing operating budgets in accordance with greener corporate policies that build toward renewables. Lastly, again, is building on the partnerships, the P3s, between industry and government, which is definitely a key piece to securing the electric grid. So what next? In order to address the energy demands of this century and beyond, as well as focusing on reducing the risk of relying on traditional carbon-based economy, we must take a deeper dive into green renewables, of course, both to enhance resiliency and to help combat climate change. However, as we move forward with these new technologies, we must also rethink about how we can make these energy sources more resilient. And if we take a deeper dive, there's various plans and processes that we can refer to here. These are just a few examples of those on the right side. And that concludes my presentation along with my list of citations, and I thank you for listening in.